Sago and welcome to Let's Talk with John and Regan. Yeah, we got a little bit of Res Blues going on, but apparently the rest of the world is feeling some pretty good blues going on. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're going to talk about Breonna Taylor. We're going to bring up what's happening with the Kumiyai in the Kumiyai territory and their attempt to fight the border wall going through their territory. And we're going to talk about the folks that are oppressing the Mi'kmaq over their fishing and their lifestyles and the way that they sustain themselves. So we're going to cover a lot today. I've got my my co-host Regan DeLoggins here. Regan, it is so great to be back. We were off for a week, so it's great to be back, and it's great to hear your voice again.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back always.
All right, there we go. We were. It took me a while to catch up with you. All right. Well, and look, we've got a lot to talk about here. First off, I know how crazy everybody went when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and I've got a bunch of issues with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I'm going to go down that list. And even, look, some of what I've got to say about Ruth Bader Ginsburg even relates to Breonna Taylor. So we'll get into that. First off, look, there are a lot of people who are completely embellishing her record, making it sound like, like women wouldn't have rights if it wasn't for her or something like that. And, for one thing, I think any justice, regardless of whether they are, appear to be on the left or appear to be on the right, or, whether they really are or not, any justice who makes a proper ruling, who actually promotes justice, that should be the default. That to me, that's not exceptional. I mean, if you make a ruling that supports equality, that should be the expectation. Now, look, I get it. There hasn't been a whole lot of equality in the United States, from its origins. It was a country built on racism, slavery, genocide. So maybe it sounds like somebody's a real champion if they suggest there should be some level of equality. But I'm not so convinced that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is the champion that people want to say that she is. And I got a few reasons for thinking so. And I don't even know, Regan, you and I didn't talk a whole lot. I know that you have some issues too, and I got to assume some of them parallel mine, but I got to think that you have some too. First and foremost, I've got to mention the city of Cheryl versus Oneida. I mean, that is,
Absolutely.
as a Native person, that is the most egregious. And it's a disgrace. For one thing, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is Jewish. I mean, and that's not to put her, to put her down or to say that she should be held to a higher standard when it comes to oppression. Because let's face it, Israel demonstrates its hypocrisy over Palestine, as she has as well, by the way, on a fairly regular basis. But when I hear anybody who supports Israel's claim to land based on something, on a 2,000-year-old claim, turn around and tell the Oneidas, oh no, the land that you purchased, we're not going to let you consider that to be actually your land. You can hold title to it, a New York State title deed to it, but we're not going to let you reclaim it as Oneida land. And her ruling in the city of Cheryl versus Oneida basically reversed the lower court's ruling. So they actually had to reverse a lower court's ruling. And as far as Ruth Bader Ginsburg is concerned, it's not just her ruling. It's not just how she voted on this case. She wrote the opinion. And her opinion is laced. It's filled with racist dogma. First, without even getting into her citing the doctrine of Christian discovery and at footnote number 1 as the foundation of her ruling, she also cited 3 other legal doctrines, one called laches, one called acquiescence, and one called the doctrine of impossibility. Yes, there is a legal doctrine called the doctrine of impossibility. And all 3 of those things are false, and they're wrong. For one thing, when she says, well, they lost, jurisdiction over that land at the turn of the 19th century, 1805 or so, and they waited too long to raise any issue, and that's the doctrine of laches, right? That too much time had passed. Well, first off, there's no way that too much time passed because the Oneidas couldn't even have their case heard until the 1970s. So for her to suggest that somehow 200 years had passed and that's way too long, again, in the back of my mind is this 2,000-year-old Israel claim against the Palestinians. But again, not even addressing that. But to say that too much time had passed, I mean, that's ridiculous.
For those who are unaware, the case that John is speaking of is, Cheryl versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, which took place in 2005, in which Ginsburg delivered a huge blow to Native American sovereignty claims and voted in favor of the city of Cheryl. But at the heart of this case, where it was based on whether land parcels that were granted to the Oneida Nation by the Treaty of 1794, which had been sold and only recently repurchased. And when I say recently, within the past 30 years. And the main issue was if these parcels of land should be considered part of the reservation and therefore be exempt to local taxation to the city of Cheryl. Ginsburg, in her opinion, held that the Oneida Nation could not reassert sovereignty to the land and had to pay taxes to the city for, as you said, that it had been too long of time. Given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area, its inhabitants, and the regulatory authority constantly exercised by New York State and its counties and towns, the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief against parties other than the United States, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty in whole or in part over the parcels at the issue. That's literally what Ginsburg wrote.
Yeah, she mentioned about embers having long gone cold.
Yeah, and she even said the Oneidas long ago relinquished the reins of government and cannot gain them through open market purchases from current title holders. Now, this is a really important part of, and as you said, her entire statement based on why she voted against Oneida Nation was riddled with incredibly racist dogma, as you said. But this particular paragraph I find incredibly important because though you say that you do not, John, you said she's Jewish, but you don't expect her to think more differently and openly. I disagree. As someone who's Indigenous and Jewish and whose family has survived trauma on a number of different levels, genocide in a number of different levels, I do expect better from my kin, whether Indigenous or whether Jewish. And I specifically expect Jews to be anti-Zionist because Zionism is anti-Semitic. And so for me, I think it's incredibly poignant to discuss this because it really does bring around the hypocrisy of settler colonialism, which is that land is accessible to white people and not to non-white people. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, being a Zionist and also reasserting her claims to settler colonialism within this case, to me is a complete and utter disgrace, but also really does show the exercise of hypocrisy that exists within settler colonialism. So for me, when I, of course, I've never been a Ruth Bader Ginsburg fan. I think that she's inherently, or was rather, an inherently racist POS, if you ask me. But it's really frustrating when there are questions or discussions related to land, and when Zionists will always fall on the side of Zionism.
Well, I do want to address a few things. First off, much of the land that the Oneidas lost they lost it through not just through an outright sale. I mean, there's a whole pattern of lands that were leased, and then the white folks treated the lease like a sale. They were squeezed out of land by off of their land through all kinds of crooked dealings. And the thing that Ginsburg addresses in her ruling was, regardless of how what the conditions were or what the circumstances were with how the land was lost, that the Oneidas had lost control of the land. And of course, when she adds in footnote number 1 her definition of the doctrine of discovery, which basically she says under the doctrine of discovery, the title to the land became vested in the sovereign. First, the discovering nations of Europe, then the states, and then the United States. And so she didn't say how that happened. She just says it was done. As if the mere act of their claim for discovery gave them, which is what the doctrine of Christian discovery is. And again, born out of church dogma, out of the Vatican, out of the 15th and 16th century. So this Jewish woman is citing church dogma as the foundation for her opinion on this case. And of course, there were 7 that voted with her, 1 concurred, and one dissented. So she was with the overwhelming majority on this case. She wasn't a dissenter, as people want to try to characterize her. And the whole thing is, and I do have to clarify, or I guess put it out there, that my wife is Oneida. My children are Oneida. So I do feel impassioned about this. And when you hear that, not only does she say that the Oneidas waited too long and cites this doctrine of latches, which is, almost tantamount to a statute of limitations, when the Oneidas couldn't even have their case heard, then she also says they were silent too long. Just because she didn't hear their voices doesn't mean they were silent. And then, of course, the one that bothers me the most is this doctrine of impossibility, where she states, and she cites a case like 80 years prior out in the Yankton Sioux territory, where the courts held that it's impossible for a Native people to reacquire or to assert sovereignty over land that they had lost the sovereign control over. In that case, one of the things that was very specific was there was an attempt to remove white people from the land. Remove Americans from the land. That wasn't the case here. The Oneidas had bought this on the open market, paid a fair price for the whole thing, and simply, I call it, paid the white people to leave. But so the Oneidas had purchased the land. Nobody was being forced off the land. This ended up being an issue over taxation and over governmental control. And when she says it's impossible, and she cites this case 1,300 miles away from the city of Cheryl or Oneida Territory, and 80 years prior, she ignores a case that was a mere 200 miles down the road in Seneca Territory, where I now live, where the Senecas had a specific act of Congress that paved the way for them to reacquire lost land and take jurisdictional control over that land. This was an act of Congress that was attempted to write the Salamanca Lease Settlement. It's called the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act. There's a 1-paragraph provision at the end of that act of Congress that paves the way for a streamlined process for the Senecas to not only acquire the land, but take it off tax rolls and hold title to that land as original title. Not had the federal government hold it in trust for them, but to actually assert original title over that land. That was 15 years prior to this. So when she cites this doctrine of impossibility, it's not just racist, it's wrong. And that's where I have a big problem with what she did here. Not just her citing the doctrine of Christian discovery, but her ruling on the doctrine of impossibility, which again, she had to overturn the lower court's ruling that said, that impossibility doctrine doesn't apply here because no white people are being forced off their lands. So that's where I have some major problems. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ginsburg also wrote and this is all public record. People can read this. But she also wrote, the Oneidas long ago relinquished the reins of government and cannot regain them through open market purchases from current title holders. Now, this sentence to me is incredibly poignant because then how the hell are we supposed to get our land if we can't do it through open market purchases? If we can't do it, it's not like people are gifting land back in large enough parcels. So in the end, there is actually no way for us to access or regain, quote unquote, regain the reins of government and control. Now, mind you, I really love Carol Goldberg, a law professor from the University of California at Los Angeles, wrote this amazing analysis specifically on Ginsburg's decision, in which he said that not only is it wildly anti-Indian, but that it's incredibly offensive and implies that Native nations are this relic of America's past and that tribal sovereignty is non-existent in the present day. And that resonated with me in such a way because for a lot of people, Indigenous sovereignty is a relic of the past. For most white people, we are we are in museums. We do not exist in, within the present day.
We're
Obviously, that's all
mascots. We're
wrong.
mascots, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, that Carol Goldberg's analysis coupled with this quote that Ginsburg said that in fact that we as Indigenous people cannot regain through open market purchases really is it really proves this point that people just the American government will make it as difficult as possible for Indigenous people to claim or regain land and exercise tribal sovereignty on it. I mean, we're seeing the same issue being exercised right now at the Kumiyai border in so-called Mexico and the United States, which is that even on our land, the federal government is allowed to make distinct and violent changes.
Well,
So
and this gets into I did a video on the 5 policies of the United States, and I try to explain that even the policy that the United States claims exists that they're operating under now, which is self-determination, isn't self-determination. It's not self-determination in the international context of the word. It's not about in fact. The United States opposes the suggestion that Native people can assert sovereignty over their land. They just mean self-determination is they can have their own little organizations. They can have membership. We're not going to recognize citizenship. We're going to recognize them as members of a tribe, not citizens of a nation. So
we're in a club.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is clearly, and this is exactly what you're saying. When we try to assert real control over our lands, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's sometimes tax issues, whether it's land use issues, this is where we run into a major conflict with the United States.
I also want folks to understand that people listening to this who may be big fans of RBG may be like, oh, this was just one faux pas within her career voting against Oneida Nation. But in fact, RBG actually, the reality is that she was not progressive, but actually in her voting record, which if you look up, voted often with conservatives.
Sure.
She dissented once, maybe twice for white women, but never actually exercised what liberals or leftists would see as progressive or radical. And I would really urge people to read this amazing article that came out it was published on August 12th by the New York Times and then updated on September 20th. And it's written by Amanda Hess. And the article is titled, "The Fandom Around RBG is Out of Step with Reality."
Exactly.
And it's really great because not only does it talk about this fandom obsession, and it is capitalistic. You can buy RBG mugs and hats and all these things. It's really this ingrained consumerism. But it also goes through and discusses her missteps as a Supreme Court justice, and also criticizes how problematic it is that people put all of their faith in one person to be the bringer of justice, rather than looking at community members, at community organizers, rather than putting faith in the people who are out on the streets. They look to this one person whose actual record is wildly disappointing.
I mean, some people trying to characterize her as some sort of the last guardian against tyranny, and that's just ludicrous. I'm so disappointed, and I would hope that that's a wake-up call and radicalizes people, that if you're putting all your faith in one person to be that was the person to protect us between fascism and not, like, do you still support the U.S. government then? Do you still support federal policy? Like, if you are putting all of your hopes and dreams and aspirations in one person and they die, because that's inevitable. Mind you, she was ill and old. Like, she had to die. Like, that is part of life. Well, I'm going to talk about that too, because but before I even get to that, one of the things, because I'd like to wrap up at least most of the RBG stuff in the first half hour because we do have a lot to get into. But one of the things that she did is she wrote a book. So again, more capitalizing on her on her position of privilege. She writes a book, and then I heard some people say, in that book she kind of expressed some remorse for some of her bad rulings. Well, big effing deal that she did that. So she makes money apologizing in a book for, and I don't think she had a clear. I didn't read the book, and I won't read the book. But when I hear somebody says, "Well, yeah," in her book she kind of goes over that. She didn't redeem herself. She didn't correct the bad ruling. But I'll tell you, when she was out on the book tour, and she was out there doing an interview with Katie Couric. Katie Couric asked her, "What's your opinion on Colin Kaepernick?" And I am wearing my number 7 Colin Kaepernick, fist in the air T-shirt, by the way. Couric asked her about Colin Kaepernick, and she basically said that his protest was dumb. And that it was disrespectful. So she characterizes a black person who's standing up against police violence, death by cop, and says that his actions are dumb and disrespectful, and then goes on to say, his taking a knee is ridiculous. So here's where I gotta throw some shade on all these white folks, these so-called allies, and Native people who are out there saying, say your name, no peace, no justice. Well, you better remember that the person who took a knee and lost a career over this thing, she called dumb. She didn't just she wasn't content just disagreeing with the protest. She actually had to diminish it. She had to insult him. She had to make it sound like that he was somehow ignorant, because you can't say somebody's actions are dumb without implying that the person behind those actions is ignorant and beneath her. So her comments about Colin Kaepernick were racist, because it wasn't just that she wasn't content just saying she disagreed with it. I mean, she said taking a knee during the national anthem was the same as flag burning, which I don't have a problem with that either. And she says I wouldn't lock him up for that, but it's ridiculous, is what she said. That's what she says in her interview. So for all of these people who are across Facebook who are now outraged because nobody was being convicted for the murder of Breonna Taylor, just remember, if you're also got Ruth Bader Ginsburg as your profile picture, if you've got all of this RBG stuff that you've weighed in on, well, then that's a slap in the face of Breonna Taylor. Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not get her life cut short because she was fighting as a champion of the people. She didn't get her career thrown away because she stood up against police violence. No, she called protests against police violence dumb and ridiculous.
I also need folks to understand that after that interview, she was called out. People were like, how can you say that about Colin Kaepernick? And she said, I didn't know much on the subject. Then don't comment on the subject.
Well, she obviously didn't know much about the doctrine of impossibility either, when she somehow ignored the fact that the Senecas could reacquire lost land and said, well, that's impossible to be done. So, yeah, this pioneer, as people want to call her, this rock star, I got some major problems with it. Here's the other place. Go ahead, please.
Well, what I was going to say also is that I need people to understand that, yes, there are things that she did at the beginning of her career as white women people might celebrate. Fine. But we also have to talk about this as a larger systemic issue. It is absurd that someone can be a Supreme Court justice their entire life. That's absurd.
Well, and that's kind of where I want to go here, because think about this. Well, all of this controversy because Trump is going to name her replacement. Then why the frick didn't she retire when she was 80 freaking years old? When Obama was president, Obama could have replaced her, but no, she's got to cling on to this position of power, this supreme position of white privilege, and take it into the Trump administration. And lo and behold, she's been sick for a decade, and so she dies during the Trump administration. So all these people, I'm saying, why isn't the left pissed that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not retire during the Obama administration? Why aren't they pissed off? Instead, you're gonna try to flip flop the same as the Republicans, saying, "Oh, he shouldn't be able to name a president in an election year." Well, that's not what you were saying when Obama was the president. I mean, both the Republicans and the Democrats are flip flopping on this issue.
I also think that it's important that folks know that, please, I urge people listening, I urge you to look at her voting record, not to damn her and her positionality historically, but rather to realize the reality of what she was as a person and what she did as a Supreme Court justice. She voted in 2018 to allow for a pipeline to go underneath the Appalachian Trail. She voted with, she, again, overturned a lower court ruling in this instance as well, and voted in the majority with conservatives. And only two people dissented the opinion, Sonia Sotomayor and Justice Elena Kagan. And
they're far more progressive than Ruth Bader Ginsburg ever was. Far more. Yeah.
Far more. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg voted for the pipeline to go through. She is not a champion of progressive or radical ideals, but is in fact a champion of the status quo. And the status quo is capitalistic, it's anti-Indian, it's anti-Black, and it's pro-environmental resource destruction. We cannot. And I really need folks to get that and understand that so that we can stop highlighting or worshiping people who are mediocre in their careers and rather push forward for actual change.
Hey, I got to mention another case too.
That is important.
There's another case too. When it came to the Asian rock band that wanted to copyright the slants, look, the Supreme Court knew that this was a bigger issue than somebody of Asian descent wanting to reclaim a racial slur for their name, but they wanted to be able to copyright that name. Now, there was this Lanham Act that was out there that prevented copyright protection for racial slurs and foul speech. So they knew that the Washington football team was hanging on this case. So there's another example of a ruling where she voted with the majority. I think it was even a unanimous decision. Nobody had the foresight to say, you know what? I don't think. Even if the Washington football team wanted to continue to use that name, which obviously they bailed on anyway, or if an Asian man wanted to use a racial slur, that's fine if they want to use it. But the idea that they should get government protection for a racial slur, that's what the issue was. That was the Lanham Act, and she voted with the majority to that would ultimately in a way vindicate the Washington football team for using a racial slur. And they weren't Native people reclaiming a racial slur. This is again a white man who said, "No, I'm going to keep the name. You can print that in caps. Never going to change it." Well, it didn't turn out that way.
I just find this fascination, this elevation of mediocre neoliberals to be so devastating to the actual movements and calls for abolition and for change and for justice. And I just feel that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the consumeristic and capitalistic definition of her career has been so detrimental and really taken away specifically from Black and brown people who have done the work and been demonized for it. And rather she has been celebrated for just being so damn. She's just been placid and she's just placated, and it's disappointing to see. And also, I would like to remind people that you can mourn and still critique, and it's important to do the two simultaneously.
I got called a misogynist because I raised some of these issues. And look, I never brought up any gender issues with her, but or about her. But I literally got called a misogynist on my group page because of raising the Oneida case and some of her other comments. I mean, it really is absurd. But I also have a major problem with the fact that that her clinging to this position put her in a spot that now Trump gets to put another Supreme Court nominee in. Well, there you go.
And he's gonna.
Oh, go ahead. Well, my point is that he's going to put somebody in that's going to be conservative, and you know what, she could have stepped down during the Obama administration and given Obama another opportunity to put another Sotomayor on, put another Kagan on. But and anybody who says, well, yeah, but she was at the pinnacle, and she was the this champion, and that she was the greatest hope for the Supreme Court, that's just bullshit. That's just wrong.
Well, I think I would, and to tie this back into what you were saying in reference to Breonna Taylor, who's, if people did not read the the Attorney General of Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, who is a complete garbage can person in general.
Yeah.
His entire speech yesterday was just gaslighting and so disappointing. I will also remind you that Daniel Cameron is one of the top choices to be put into the Supreme Court position in the Trump administration. And he is not just a disappointment on a number of levels, but a conservative who specifically worked against the Black community in Louisville.
Sure.
And he is the top contender, especially after yesterday's ruling, which which is just horrible and just such an injustice and egregious.
We're gonna take a break, and we're gonna talk about the Breonna Taylor case after the break. So let's do that. Reggie will take us out with some music, and we'll come right back. And we want to talk about Breonna Taylor. We want to talk about what's happening in Kumiyai territory and in Micmac territory. So we'll do that when we come back. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins, and this is Let's Talk. All right, thanks for coming back. Hey, that's a little bit of Jeff Doreen, Gordunawage, doing Across the Universe. It's appropriate to play a John Lennon tune, at least considering what we're talking about here. It's ironic that I heard people singing Imagine out in front of the Supreme Court in a chorus of Ginsburg supporters, which is really just absurd. But now we'll stick with a Mohawk version of Across the Universe by Jeff Doreen. Hey, look, I do want to encourage people to support the program, support WBAI, become a WBAI buddy. Look, we used to be neck and neck with many of the other programs. I don't know where we are in the buddy program, but I'd love to sign up 10 or 20 buddies who make a donation of $5, $10, $15, $20 a month in the name of this show to support WBAI. You can go to the website, which is www.give2wbai.org. That's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org, and follow the prompts. Let me see. What's the? Let me finger here. I got the. Oh, yeah, and the pledge line is 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a pledge. Do it in the name of this program. Let people know that you support this perspective, even if you don't agree with it. At least let people know that you're energized by the conversation. And please do make a donation to WBAI in the name of this show. All right, hey, so the ruling came down, or not the ruling, the grand jury refused and failed to prosecute anybody for the murder of Breonna Taylor. They brought a couple of indictments, which you'll probably skate on, against one of the officers for wanton recklessness for the shots that missed Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend, and went through the wall, I think, into the apartments of some white folk.
Into the neighboring apartment.
Into the neighboring apartment. So that's the only thing, and only one of the officers. Now, for one thing, Breonna Taylor did not fire on these guys. Breonna Taylor didn't have a weapon. These guys busted into her home, and her boyfriend. I mean, look, there's all these stand your ground laws in various states. If somebody breaks into your home and you shoot them, that's not a crime. In fact, her boyfriend didn't get charged with shooting at the police. I mean, he's not facing any prosecution. Why? Because he didn't do anything wrong. They did something wrong. They came in with guns, and whether he fired first or they fired first, they came in unannounced, busted in the door in the middle of the night, like after midnight, and in a barrage of gunfire. That certainly was asymmetric to whatever shots were fired by Breonna's boyfriend. Killed Breonna Taylor, who did not fire a weapon, by the way. Again. Didn't kill the the shooter. So what the hell were they shooting at? But regardless of all this stuff, not a single charge against for her murder, and that's what this was. This was a violent murder of a 26-year-old girl. Woman. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't want to minimize. This was a woman who, had turned her life around. She had lifted herself out of a probably not a great situation. In fact, situations that many black people find themselves in because of policies, U.S. policies. She had turned herself around, was helping people. She was an EMT or an emergency room technician, and she had her life snuffed out by police. And look, for all those people who say, look, they had all this surveillance that they had done on her, then if they had all this accurate surveillance, they should have known that there was that whatever previous boyfriend was involved with, that's not who she was involved with anymore. Instead, they went in and they shot up her place, killed her, and not again, you brought up the Attorney General. Look, this is a travesty. I mean, this is just an absolute travesty.
I think that, so I watched the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron's statement yesterday. And I think many of us assumed that things were not going to be great when they started locking down Louisville the day before. I think many of us who have been following this were aware that that the charges would be, I guess, lukewarm at best, and to find out that no one was indicted on her murder, like no one. The one in the first degree wanton endangerment, which is a Class C felony, it carries a penalty of 1 to 5 years per charge, and the officer is charged with 3 of those. So maybe he would get 15 years, but we know better than that. And folks, that wanton endangerment charge is unrelated to Breonna Taylor.
Absolutely.
It's for firing into the neighboring apartment.
Right.
So they care more about the walls than they do about the black woman who was shot unjustly in her own home. Now, what I found so wildly disturbing was that that Attorney General Daniel Cameron made the statement yesterday that it was not a no-knock warrant, which is a blatant lie. And the decision based that it wasn't a no-knock warrant was that out of the 12 people that they interviewed in the apartment complex, one of the 12 said that they heard the police officers announce their presence. Mind you, there is not a clarification on whether they announced their presence before or after they busted down the door. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend asked who was it multiple times with no response. And then when the door was busted down, they said police. So that is a no-knock warrant. That is exactly what that is. And so the fact that the Attorney General would gaslight the community in such a horrendous way, when in fact, 1 out of 12 people, that means 11 of those people said that they heard and what happened and that the police did not announce their presence at the door.
Well, and to be clear,
Breonna Taylor's boyfriend would have the right to stand his ground and shoot at police
and he
officers.
This guy wasn't a criminal. This guy would have had no reason to fire upon police officers. And there was nothing in the apartment that they would have needed to, they weren't doing anything wrong or anything illicit in there. There would have been no reason for Breonna Taylor's boyfriend to fire on police. There would be plenty of reason to fire upon somebody who broke in brandishing guns. And look, they probably weren't even in they weren't even in uniform, were they? I mean, weren't they all just,
No, they were plainclothes cops. They were plainclothes cops.
Yeah.
If someone busted into my house, plain clothes in the middle of the night, and I had access to a gun, I would react as I reacted.
Sure. And this is a woman's apartment.
It's a justified reaction.
This is a woman's apartment being intruded upon, being trespassed upon by a bunch of men. This guy was absolutely justified in shooting at them, and that's why they didn't charge him. But again, she didn't fire upon them. So at very least, how could they say this was wanton and reckless firing of a weapon? Only on the shots that went through the wall into the neighbor's apartment. How is not the shot that killed her not manslaughter? They killed somebody who was not a threat to them, and they are the ones who perpetrated the violence in this situation.
Yeah, I find that the reactions to this to be so wildly disturbing in terms of the way that we as people define injustices, and the fact that I honestly cannot handle how the Attorney General made this announcement.
Yeah.
I watched the entirety of it, and the whole time I was so angry and livid because it was such an egregious miscarriage of justice. How could anyone argue that this was not a no-knock warrant, that people were justified into shooting into an apartment, that they're plainclothes cops coming into a space unannounced.
Yeah.
And yet he even said that their shootings were justified. There is no justification, none whatsoever, to shoot at people. Cops should not be armed at all in the first place.
Well, and this thing was
imagine.
This was mishandled not only on the night, but every day since then. Most people didn't even know about this till Floyd's murder. This didn't even hardly get any traction any place. So it is in spite of the fact that Louisville has such a bad track record in the first place. I mean, this is just amazing. It's just amazing, and look, I fully support. I support all of the all of the protests, and frankly, Louisville's got nothing coming as far as I'm concerned.
I also want to remind folks that Louisville has, first of all, nonviolent protests will not save us. The abolishment of the complete settler state will save us, and violence is necessary to do that. But I need to remind folks that Kentucky has a Democratic governor, that Louisville has a Democratic mayor, and the city council president is a Democrat. And none of that prevented any of this because Democrats will not save you.
Well, even people of color in these positions, like Cameron, even people of color doesn't look. Changing the skin tone or the name tags or whether somebody's a R or a D after the name doesn't change the system.
No, this is all systemic. You have to completely abolish the system as it exists because there is no justice within reform. We cannot reform a system that is based on the theft of indigenous lands and the enslavement of Black folks. We cannot reform that. You can't reform the police department. You have to dismantle and destroy it. And it's so frustrating that even in times of egregious miscarriages with Breonna Taylor, that people in any way could advocate and tell folks, oh, well, if you're angry, go vote.
Yeah,
no,
for Biden.
Man,
for
I'm
Biden,
angry,
right?
I am for Biden.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to throw a Molotov cocktail at the cops. Don't even come for me in any way, shape, or form and try to tell me that I need to be complacent in this. And I know that people are going to hear this and be, probably going to get in trouble, but it does not matter. This does not matter. Me getting in trouble for saying this on a radio does not matter. What matters are the people's lives that are constantly endangered by the settler state. Like
Well,
that is the
and I'll tell you, as
reality of
Native
what we
people,
live in.
we will oppose this stuff, especially on our territories. But no, I think everybody has to do this.
Always.
And look, before we run out of time, I do want to at least mention what's happening in Kumiyai territory and Mi'kmaq territory. Look, there some I mean this blatant racist woman literally was attacking, I mean, and went after some native women, some Kumeyaay women who were
Oh, the
protesting.
Karen in the desert.
Yeah, Karen in the desert. They were protesting the wall going through, Trump's wall being proposed through their territory, and this white woman just lost her freaking mind. But this is what we face when we try to defend our territories. It's referencing what you talked about in the
Absolutely.
first half.
I think it's important. So just for folks to understand what's happening on Kumiyai, Kumiyai Nation is an indigenous nation that's made up of 5 different bands, 4 of which are federally recognized. And their land is on the so-called border between Mexico and the United States. So currently, this wall that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is building that the Trump administration is supporting, in order to, decrease illegal immigration. I say this all in quotes because that's not real. Borders are not real. But the fact that they're building this through federally recognized tribal land has, of course, led to a number of people organizing. The Kumeyaay Land Defenders, Camp Land Back. People are really organized, and it's not just Kumeyaay. There's Tohono O'odham and Tohono O'odham, which are other indigenous nations that are also organizing to stop the desecration of their land, or the desecration of this wall, and also will literally divide their communities. Like, this is going through community land. Imagine putting up a wall in your neighborhood and then you're not allowed to go to the other side and move and migrate freely.
It's environmentally unjust. It's culturally unjust. It's inhumane. It's everything you could possibly think of. That's what this idea that you can just run this man-made barrier to stop people, any living creature, from crossing a man-conceived line in the sand is just bizarre.
And this goes hand in hand with what we were discussing earlier in terms of sovereign tribal nations, governments, and when we exercise our rights, how we're not actually sovereign. I mean, we are as indigenous people, sovereign people, but we are not actual sovereign nations within the eyes of the federal government. Ruth Bader Ginsburg voting against the Oneida Nation and crushing this, the parcel, the land parcel, the lack of paying taxes on these land parcels is one example, but so is this. What's happening on Kumiyai. These are federally recognized tribes, which, mind you, that's also a complicated discussion. But nonetheless, they have rights to their sovereignty, rights to their land. There's very specific things that they are allowed to exercise as long as it does not impede with the federal government wanting to expand its settler colonial narrative.
Now Stephen Newcomb, who wrote The Pagans in the Promised Land, and whose book is the video, The Doctrine of Discovery, the film Doctrine of Discovery, Unmasking the Domination Code, mentions the Kumeyaay specifically because they too had the doctrine of Christian discovery used in a case against them, basically diminishing that they merely have the right to occupy the territory that they claim, that they have no governmental controls over the land. And so Newcomb even brought it up in the film, The Doctrine of Discovery. So, I mean, it repeats itself. And again, that's what pisses me off so much about what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did in Oneida, because this has repeated itself over and over and over again. All right, just before we go here, let's also talk about what the Mi'kmaq are going through in trying to support themselves in what has been one of their cultural means of support, of sustenance. They are being invaded by white people who are vandalizing their source of income. What you got for us there?
Yeah, sure. For folks that are and I hope that we can kind of dive into this more within the following weeks, because this will continue. But for those who are unaware, the Micmac or the Mi'kmaq are a group of Indigenous people in so-called Canada, specifically in Nova Scotia. And there have been conflicts that have been rising in terms of Mi'kmaq people exercising their right to lobster fish off the coast of Nova Scotia, specifically in St. Mary's Bay. And for Acadian people who are non-Indigenous people have been coming, surrounding the Micmac boats, cutting their trap lines, cutting their fishing, releasing their lobster traps, and really creating a lot of damage for the Mi'kmaq community, in which, they have a right to continue to fish off of the coast. Like this is their, this is their right. And the Supreme Court of Canada has voted in favor of that as well. But the Acadian fishers have still continuously have gotten dangerously close to Mi'kmaq lobster boats, have shot fireworks and flare guns
yep.
into their boats, have really damaged a number of their boats in order to withhold them of their sovereign right to continue to fish.
Well, and they've not just vandalized and destroyed, but they've stolen their lobster traps. And and look, these things. I mean, these things aren't the easiest things to come by. If your entire means of sustenance comes from bringing a lobster, and to have vandals go in there and destroy or steal your lobster traps. Look, they've got to find the means to replace these things.
Also, this is a self-managed lobster fishery, First Nation self-managed lobster fishery, and it marks the 21st anniversary of the affirmation by the Supreme Court of Canada to the right of Indigenous peoples of Eastern Canada to continue to hunt and fish for their living and their livelihood. And I also want to remind folks that there's only been 5 lobster licenses that have been issued to the members of the Sepeknik-Katik First Nations, which limits them to 50 traps each. Mm-hmm. And Acadian fishers are coming out to hassle and harass 5 lobster licenses that have been given to this entire nation. It's like the heated opposition that non-Indigenous commercial fishermen are really showing up. And it created a blockade of rope, to really... We'll
continue
their aspect.
We'll continue to follow this story and talk more about it, and as well as what's happening in Kumiyai territory and some of the other border territories that are facing the Trump wall debacle. We will continue with this, but I want to thank you for being such an integral part of the conversation on Ginsburg and Breonna Taylor and all of it.
Of course.
We'll be back here next week, and we'll do it all again. Look forward to your comments, and I hope you guys took something from the show today. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins, and this is Let's Talk. We'll see you next time. Yahweh.